Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised.
For me, it was the moms that always got to me. And at 2 a.m. in the middle of trial, when you're exhausted and you're trying to balance, you have 3 more hours of work to do, but you have to get at least 3 or 4 hours of sleep to be effective the next day. You just don't think you can turn another page. You think of that mom, it motivates you for sure.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Branden. You're listening to episode 117, Justified.
That's one of the few cases where, like that scenario, big burly guy who's motivated to murder a young woman, that ends one way, and that's with her in a ditch or on the side of a road or, on one of those cold autopsy tables. And that was just one of those between Cash the hero dog and her badassery, it has a happy ending. So that is, the world was a better place the second that guy friggin' died.
We're going to get to the details of that case later in the show. But first, I want to take you back more than a decade before the so-called Dirty John case landed on this prosecutor's desk.
Matt Murphy. I'm a former homicide prosecutor at Orange County, California, and author of the newly released Book of Murder.
Matt has tried and won a lot of high-profile cases in California, which he chronicles in his new memoir, The Book of Murder. But before he gets into the cases, he gives readers a window into the job.
It's an interesting thing, when you do one thing for so long. I was a DA for 26 years, and I spent 21 years in sexual assault and homicide exclusively in a vertical capacity. So Orange County does it a little differently than most DA's offices. Orange County they utilize what is known as a vertical system, which is cases are basically the prosecutors start the night the crime happens or the day the crime happens. So you're assigned a section of the county. So for sexual assault, I had West Orange County, so I had like Huntington Beach and Westminster and those places. So I was responsible for all the sex crimes that took place. And then when I moved into homicide in 2002, I had Costa Mesa, Laguna Beach, Irvine, and Newport, and I was automatically responsible for all of the murders that happened in those cities for the 17 years I was there. So you start at the crime scene, you help the police with warrants, you determine who gets charged with what, when there's enough evidence, you present the case to the first judge, you present the case to the second judge, you do the preliminary hearing or grand jury, and then all the way up through trial. And that was my gig for 17 years. It is super intense. It's fascinating. And I did it for a long time, but I still miss it every day.
And Matt explains what it means to him to be a prosecutor.
The two criteria for prosecutor filing a case is, one, you subjectively believe the guy did it or the woman did it. And number two, you believe you have a reasonable chance of success in front of a jury. And if you don't have both of those at the same time, as a prosecutor, you can't ethically file charges. So the second part of that is that's a moving goalpost. The better you get, the more experience you get, the more trust you have with your detectives or the judge. You can try and win tougher and tougher cases the longer you stay.
Over the years, Matt would hone his skills, and he made the choice to dedicate his life to pursue justice for victims, their families, and society as a whole.
The difference between winning and losing and winning and, of course, achieving justice is really razor thin. And a lot of times it's just that extra bit of work, that one thought you have in the middle of the night that slam dunks the defense expert, that if you can't convince the jury that they're wrong, you're going to lose. Like those things, for me anyway, it took pretty much everything I had to give. So yeah, I decided pretty early in my time in homicide that as long as I was there, I was going all in, and I was going to devote myself as fully and completely as I could to those cases and those families. And it wasn't exactly my plan, but next thing I know, 17 years went by, and and it was time for me to move on to what was next.
In his book, Matt gets pretty candid about how that kind of drive and motivation for justice isn't just intoxicating, but addictive.
It takes a tougher and tougher case to get that same sort of buzz, So I was also one of the 2 cold case deputies in the unit. So I was reaching back farther and farther and doing cases that were thinner and thinner, where you absolutely know the guy did it and you don't want him to get away with it. So
I think that's the part that I was kind of, you tapped into that main line, is that when you get to be so good, you better be right. No ego needs to be involved here. You better believe that, because if you're really good, you could put someone away for the rest of their lives. And I liked it that you were confident in the book, but you also kind of tempered that with like, hey, I have a soul, and it's not just about my ego. And I believe that these people did this, because I've just done this true crime genre, and some of the detectives or some of the prosecutors, and you're like, are they really doing it for the right reason? And have they gotten tunnel vision?
Well, right. The job of a prosecutor fundamentally is to do justice, not to get convictions. And, that's one of you see this in movies all the time, where there'll be some dastardly murder committed or some terrible crime, and somebody will be yelling at the detective like, we need an arrest. And I will usually throw something at my TV right about then, because there's anybody who arrests the wrong person for a horrible crime, like, that's not a feather in your professional cap. In fact, that's the way careers end. There's nothing worse than charging the wrong person for a murder. And because then 2 things happen. Number one, nobody wants to prosecute somebody who's innocent, regardless of political pressure or whatever, or media. Like, none of that truly matters when it comes to making that decision. And then the second part is, it means that the real bad guy is still out there, and probably going to do it again. So there's a human and a professional and a legal disincentive to ever doing that. It's about catching the right person, and only charging them when the evidence, again, you are subjectively convinced beyond all doubt as a prosecutor, and that you believe that there's probable cause or reasonable likelihood that you are going to convict. You believe that the evidence itself will be, come out beyond a reasonable doubt in front of a jury. That's the filing standard.
Matt made it a part of his job as a homicide prosecutor to go to every single crime scene.
Interviewing a detective a couple of years ago, and he made the distinction. No, he wasn't a detective. He was the prosecuting attorney, and he was like, I always went to my crime scenes. And that's not always the case, because the way that he kind of put butter on it was like, this is unusual and gives me a better advantage. And that doesn't always happen. So you went to every single crime scene.
Yeah, he's absolutely right. Like, you as a prosecutor, you're not required to go, but if you're dedicated to it, you're going to go. You will never attend a crime scene where you don't see something that you won't use in closing argument. And it is, I think it's critically important. I would always train the young prosecutors that came into the unit or the DA's office, especially on the important cases where the crime scene matters. The attending it, like I had one, it was a 7-Eleven murder, poor clerk got murdered by 2 skinheads. I talk about that in the book. And that was one where I went to do the warrants, and we were waiting for the night judge to sign it. And it was the coldest night I can ever remember in Southern California. And these knuckleheads, after committing the murder, to change their appearance, they ran off into the night and they stripped off their jackets and their outer layer of clothing. So there's this trail of evidence. And we find one of them hiding in the bushes with shorts and a t-shirt. Now, just on cold 2-dimensional paper, the police dog found him in the bushes at 3 a.m, and he's dressed accordingly. But when you're there was, when it came down to argument that, it's like, ladies and gentlemen, it was 32 degrees in Southern California. Nobody in the entire region of Southern California was in shorts and a t-shirt. Like, you can sell it, and the jury never knows that you're there. But whoever that person was you interviewed, they're absolutely right. You got to go to the crime scene. You'll always see something that stands out that will be important in the jury trial.
And finally, Matt shares what truly has motivated him to dedicate his life to the pursuit of justice.
I follow a guy on Instagram. I saw him. He did a post the other day. He's a military guy, and he had a shirt on that said, "I exist out of spite." And it's kind of like the same thing as a prosecutor. Like, you exist to stick it to those guys, because the first thing I would always do after filing charges is I would meet with the families. And when, I don't know what it is about, I mean, the moms in particular for me, when you are the lifeline to justice, as corny as that might sound, for a mother whose child was murdered for, money for meth or sexual gratification or stupid bar fight, whatever it is, and you've got some a-hole who killed another human being and there's different kinds of murder. We talk about that in the book, the taxonomy of murders, the different, child abuse is different than a conspiracy to kill for money, which is different than a bar fight and different than a gang murder. But at the end of the day, there is a mother who's lost their kid. And when you meet with those people, you understand, when you go to the scene and you see the poor dead victim, and then you meet with the parents. My old boss, Lou Rosenblum, used to say that you can always see the soul of your victim reflected in the eyes of those who love them, which is it's a heavy duty thing. And when you see a dead person, it's one thing. When you meet that person's mother at the apex of their grief, you bear a really significant responsibility, and a lot of that is you want justice. You want to make sure the guy who did it didn't get away with it, and that is hugely motivating. And I'll tell you, another layer of that is if you attend the postmortem examination and you see what happens when that person's little girl or little boy is literally dissected for forensic purposes in front of your eyes. And whatever the motivation is for murder, it's called, there's plenty of times where people can lawfully kill each other. And there's plenty of people that deserve to get killed, depending on the circumstances. Like, somebody that breaks into somebody's house in the middle of the night, sorry. California says that's good shooting, as does almost every other state. So there's certainly circumstances where homicide, which just means one human killing another, is justified.
Which brings us back to the case of Dirty John. In 2014, Deborah Newell was 59 years old, and she was living her best life in Orange County. She had built a very successful interior design business. She was the mother of 4 adult children and had been divorced as many times. Deborah had worked hard, and she could buy just about whatever she wanted and do just about whatever she wanted. But what she really yearned for was someone to share her life with. She craved companionship and romantic love, which is why she waded into the waters of online dating, began scrolling through profiles, and early on, it was pretty obvious there were a lot of frogs. The necessary work that would hopefully lead to her Prince Charming. But what she should have been worried about were the sharks.
This is a really good cautionary tale for all these people, men and women, that are, and everybody's dated online if you're single in the last 10 years. I've certainly done it, like we all have. And I've had horrible experiences too, but, and good ones.
When Deborah landed on John Meehan's profile, he appeared to be her ideal man. He loved animals and children. He was an anesthesiologist who had worked with Doctors Without Borders in Iraq. And yes, he was handsome, at over 6 feet tall, and in great shape. What she didn't know was that his entire profile had been curated for women like her. Women of a certain age who had money and were looking for a successful, highly intelligent man to sweep them off their feet.
It's so terrifying if you get into sites of a scammer like this.
But that's what his deal was. He would prey on women online. He had a horrific criminal history.
It's pretty much common knowledge that the best and most manipulative scammers mix in lies with the truth, which was exactly John Meehan's recipe for success, at least in making his con seem believable. He wasn't a doctor, but he at one time had been a nurse anesthesiologist. He'd spent enough time in the operating room to know how to sell being a doctor. He even arrived at the restaurant for his very first date with Deborah, wearing surgical scrubs.
He was a former nurse anesthetist, so he was a professional. He was, he was a practicing anesthesiologist, essentially, without the medical degree.
Now, Deborah chalked up John showing up wearing those scrubs as nothing more than a bit quirky. After all, he was a busy and successful doctor. It was easy for her to ignore the red flags because from the beginning they had serious chemistry. Deborah was drawn to John's magnetism and how refreshing it was to go on a date with a man who was intelligent and charismatic, but also genuinely interested in what was going on with her. Now that was intoxicating. From that first date, their relationship would ramp up very quickly. They would go on long walks together, where Deborah was always center stage, and he also fulfilled her romantic desires, bringing her bouquets of her favorite flowers and cuddling with her all night long, which she loved. John made her feel safe and protected. In fact, Deborah believed that John was everything she had ever wanted in a man. Unfortunately, John, by then, had perfected his scam to a T. He was playing the role of the perfect partner. He made sure to keep the focus on Deborah, especially when she asked about him. He was an expert in deflection, because the last thing he wanted was for Deborah to find out that just 2 days before their very first date, John had been released from prison, that he'd lost his nursing license because he was a drug addict and a criminal.
He knew the deal. He actually did it until he got fired for stealing his patient's medication, and he lost his license in the Midwest.
John Meehan wasn't just a scammer. He was extremely dangerous, as his ex-wife would later attest to. In the early 90s, John Meehan married 25-year-old nurse anesthetist Tanya Sells. From the beginning, he lied about his age, saying he was 26 when he was really 31, and none of John's family would be invited to the wedding. He would tell Tanya that his parents were drug addicts who would ruin their wedding if they were invited. However, John would invite some of his old college buddies to the wedding, and that's when she first heard his nickname, Dirty John. Apparently, his friends started calling him that after John bragged about all the women that he would bring back to his apartment and the things that he'd done to them. Tanya and John would have 2 daughters, and over the next decade, she would help put John through nursing school. But after 10 years of marriage, things started to fall apart. And out of the blue, John went to Tanya and demanded a divorce. Now that he was making good money, he didn't need her anymore. He also wanted to cut off contact with his daughters. A blindsided Tanya had no idea where this was coming from, which is why in July of 2000, she did something she'd never done before. She reached out to her mother-in-law, Dolores, something John had told her never to do. It was then that Tanya learned the truth, that John had lied about his age, his full birth name, even his birth date, and that he had a drug charge against him in California. That lying was something that John had perfected as a child. According to an interview with the Los Angeles Times, John Meehan's sisters would say that their father, William Meehan, had taught his son how to scam insurance companies with phony lawsuits. He learned the art of jumping in front of moving cars to then file a claim. He would put glass in his food at restaurants to then extort the owner, among other frauds. He also learned from his father how to hold a grudge and the importance of getting even. After Tanya learned the truth from her mother-in-law, she searched their home, looking to find out more about John. And that's when she found a box he'd hidden in the closet that contained a stash of surgical anesthetic drugs that he'd stolen from patients. Tanya reported the theft to the police, prompting an investigation into John Meehan in September of 2000. When John found out, he left threatening messages on Tanya's answering machine, which she recorded for investigators. The most chilling threat was when John said, quote, "When it happens, Tanya, and you see it in your eyes, remember it was me, okay? Tanya, you enjoy your time left on this earth, okay? Because that's what it's going to come down to." John would receive a suspended sentence on a menacing charge for those threats against Tanya. A couple of years later, the Warren County Sheriff's Office in Ohio would begin digging into John again after hospital workers reported seeing him bring a gun into the operating room and then observed him stealing Demerol, which he should have given to a patient. As a result of this investigation, in April of 2002, John would be stripped of his license to work as a nurse anesthetist, according to the Dayton Daily, after police had searched his home and found a loaded gun and 45 empty medicine containers for 6 different prescription medications. John was charged with felony drug theft, but instead of turning himself in, he fled to Michigan, where police would find him in a hotel room, semi-conscious, and in possession of a stolen anesthesia kit. He was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, but during transit, he jumped from the moving vehicle, taking with him stolen drugs from the ambulance. John would be arrested and would spend 17 months behind bars before he was released in 2004. And then he moved to California, where he immediately started scamming women he'd meet online.
Moves out to California and began going through a bunch of different women in California where he would kind of wine them, dine them, charm them, and then prey upon them and go after their money.
In 2013, John was under investigation after a woman went to the police and reported him for extortion and stalking. When they went to his house, they would find ammunition, a gun, cyanide capsules, zip ties, a pocket saw, cable ties, binoculars, and duct tape. He was arrested and would eventually plead guilty to possession of a firearm. He was a convicted felon, as well as stalking and extortion charges. John would be released from prison in early October 2014. 2 days later, he met Deborah Newell on an online dating site. When John met Deborah, 3 of his ex-girlfriends had restraining orders against him, and 3 more were in the process of getting their requests approved for orders of protection, something Deborah was totally unaware of. At the time, she thought she had met the man of her dreams, and when he asked her to marry him 2 months into their courtship, when they were in Las Vegas, she said yes. The thing was, even though he was supposedly a successful doctor, Deborah footed the bill for everything because John always had an excuse to explain away why he never had any money. And Deborah didn't press the issue because she'd never been happier. He took care of everything for her, ran her errands, paid her bills, with her money, of course. He even went with her to her doctor's appointments. But Deborah's daughters were not happy with her relationship with John. From the beginning, they were suspicious, especially when they found out that he didn't have a car, and they were repulsed when they saw him driving their mother's car. It solidified their belief that he was mooching off of her and that she was too blind to see what was so obvious to them. But by this time, John had begun controlling every aspect of Deborah's life and her money. And in the months following their marriage, John's facade was cracking. But Deborah didn't want to admit to herself that he was a liar. By that time, she'd already experienced his temper. The family hired a private investigator, and in 2015, Deborah was presented with court documents that showed that John had gone to jail multiple times. She saw all the restraining orders that had been issued against John, and how he was a drug addict who'd lost his nursing license. Deborah would move out of their waterfront apartment when John was in the hospital getting back surgery, but eventually reconciled with John, and they moved back in together. John continued to manipulate and exert coercive control over Deborah, isolating her from her daughters. Finally, Deborah realized she made a mistake. She saw John for what he was and got the courage to tell him that she wanted out, that she wanted a divorce. And like so many other women, she would file a restraining order against him. However, an Orange County judge would deny it, saying there was no immediate threat because at the time, John had moved to Nevada and had never physically harmed her. And that's when he began stalking Deborah and members of her family in earnest, threatening them. In June of 2016, her Jaguar was stolen from its parking spot at work, and surveillance footage would show that it was John who had taken it. The car was found a block away. He doused the inside of the vehicle with gasoline and lit it on fire. Losing control of Deborah and her money would push John over the edge, and he would have his revenge. In August of 2016, 25-year-old Tara Newell, Deborah's daughter, drove into the parking lot outside of her apartment building. She opens her car door and out jumps her faithful dog, Cash, and she follows right behind him. Once outside of the vehicle, she is ambushed from behind. She stares into the man who's glaring at her with hate-filled eyes as he says, "Do you remember me?
It was a really nice young woman named Tara Newell who was walking her dog Cash in the city of Newport Beach and came back to her apartment complex and was walking through the parking lot. And a big giant dude jumps out of a van and he's got a knife and he stabs her multiple times and tries to drag her into this van. And it was her stepdad, John Meehan, famously known as Dirty John.
He tries to push Tara into his vehicle as she continues to wrench free from his grip. When she screams, he shoves his hand over her mouth. And it was then that she bit him as hard as she could. And in that struggle, they both fall to the ground. And Cash the dog starts biting into John's ankles.
If anybody wrote this scene in a movie, nobody would believe it. And basically, Cash the dog bites him. He loses his focus on her. And this guy weighs about 235 pounds, super athletic, big guy. Tara might weigh 110 pounds soaking wet.
That day, Tara just happened to be wearing heavy-duty rain boots, the kind with a really thick tread on the bottom, and she's able to kick the knife out of John's hand. Without hesitation, she knows what she needs to do if she's going to survive. Incredibly, as a super fan of the long-running series The Walking Dead, Tara treats John as if he's a zombie. She begins to stab him over and over again, a total of 13 times, which included plunging the knife directly into his brain via his eyeball.
The dog bites him. He takes his eyes off of her. She kicks him in the hand, kicks the knife out of his hand, picks it up, and stabs him in the brain through the eye because she watches Walking Dead. And I mean, she stabbed him multiple times. And inside the van, there was a loaded gun. There were zip ties. I think there was handcuffs. There was cyanide. So he absolutely, one of the detectives called it a catch and kill kit. And he was going to murder her to get revenge against his ex-wife, which is that's a specific form of homicide. It's very rare, but you see that, people murdering people's children. I think it's called filicide is the name for it. It's very rare, but it happens. And he was going to murder her daughter to get revenge against his ex-wife and didn't calculate the fact that his wannabe victim was a total badass who watched too much Walking Dead and killed him. So that story winds up on my desk.
In an interview with ABC News, Tara would say, quote, "The last one was in the eye because that's the softest point of entry. So I wanted to kill his brain, like a zombie, essentially." Both Tara and John would be rushed to the hospital. Tara would recover from her injuries with her beloved Cash by her side, but Dirty John would not survive.
My job, of course, was to review the homicide and just, they submitted, it has to be investigated, it has to be formally cleared. It was the most perfect case of self-defense I've ever seen. And so it was my duty as a prosecutor to make sure that Tara Newell was absolved of any and all legal culpability and responsibility for that death. And in the most, meticulous way that I could do that was my job. And in that case, it was like not only an honor, it was fun to do that.
Now, the killing of John Meehan was in self-defense. Matt needed to make sure that all the T's were crossed and the I's dotted.
How long did it take from when she killed him in self-defense to her being cleared? Because that must have been really stressful for her.
Well, she was essentially cleared immediately. The detectives never saw that as anything other than exactly what it was. But it was just, we needed, one of the crazy things about working homicide cases is sometimes what appears to be one thing turns out to be something totally different. So, and I've had more than one staged crime scene where there's deliberate red herrings left by the murderer. And, my Daniel Wozniak case that I talk about in the book was one of those. He staged that scene, and Skylar De Leon on the Tom and Jackie Hawks murder showed up with, a power of attorney document and bill of sale documents that indicating Tom and Jackie had sold their yacht to him. So you always have to keep a very open mind. So when it comes to the death of a human being like that, you have to be meticulous. You have to go through, you have to investigate the whole thing. And So it's a process, and it appeared that it was a perfect case of self-defense. And the truth was that that's exactly what it was, but we still had to investigate it. So, it took, I don't know, I think in the mind of her mother, it would always take too long for it not to be officially cleared right away, but she was never in any jeopardy. And I wanted to make sure that no zippy young prosecutor or anybody else would ever want to take a second look at that. I wanted to make sure we were very thorough and that it was what it appeared to be.
Looking into John Meehan's past, investigators would find at least 50 victims who'd made extortion and stalking accusations against him.
And she did what nobody else, between all the judges and the criminal protective orders and the restraining orders and the authorities everywhere, couldn't do. And she ended this reign of terror. That's one of the few cases where, look, that scenario, big burly guy who's motivated to murder a young woman, that ends one way, and that's with her in a ditch or on the side of a road or, on one of those cold autopsy tables. And that was just one of those. Between Cash the hero dog and her badassery, it has a happy ending. So that is, the world was a better place the second that guy friggin' died. His background is just unbelievable. All the women that he preyed upon and the lives that he ruined. And so that's one that it's a very rare happy ending that I saw in the homicide unit.
Well, and it just shows his mindset that he could have killed his ex-wife, right? Who he has beef with, but it takes a little extra to want to kill the daughter because that would probably hurt her more than if he killed her. Maybe that's his mindset, which is so, like, for him, it wasn't just about the money. It was about, coercive control and power and just sick, basically. But that really shows that. So I think I totally agree with you. And I'm sure that it felt really good to kind of see something positive happen from such a horrific case, Yeah.
Well, and he died like a zombie on Walking Dead. Knife through the eyeball.
And because of that, Matt decided to reach out to a reporter at the Los Angeles Times to share the story.
This is just like, for an online dating expose, is what I thought. Like, this is a really good cautionary tale for all these people, men and women, that are, and everybody's dated online if you're single in the last 10 years. I've certainly done it, like we all have. And I've had horrible experiences too, but, and good ones. But I thought this is something that really should be shared. This guy's super predatory. People should be aware that guys like this are out there. So, and my reporter friend at the Register flaked on our lunch, and I had another buddy at the LA Times, Chris Goffard. So I invited him, and Chris Goffard, I figured he'd write an article about it, and he turned it into the international. I think there's like 40 million downloads. I had no idea that it would become the sensation that it did. And of course, Eric Bana and Connie Britton made that TV movie out of it on Bravo, and turned into this huge sensation.
Matt was referring to the Bravo TV series Dirty John. It was interesting hearing him talk about the backstory of the Dirty John podcast and TV series, which were huge hits.
My involvement, I got all the sliders I could eat at the premiere, and that was it. I think everybody hit a home run on that except for me.
That's why I know. I was like, all this from your connection to this reporter. I mean, that's like, I think obviously you were doing it for the right reasons, which is to warn people, because you absolutely did it in your book too. You had like 10 or 11 words of wisdom for, a woman who's in a relationship, like, to get out.
Which is why I highly recommend Matt Murphy's new memoir, The Book of Murder, which chronicles his biggest cases, including his work on the dating game killer, Rodney Alcala. That investigation was also recently featured on a TV series.
One of the chapters in the book was, of course, the Rodney Alcala case. That everybody can see that on Anna Kendrick's Woman of the Hour. They brought me in. I got to work on that. Super fun. And I think they did an amazing job. So anybody who's interested in that.
In his book, Matt shares a case you will never forget, and which we will definitely have him back on the show for.
Hulu is coming out with a 3-part series on my Nairi case, coming out in February. So hopefully everybody can catch that. And that's I've seen the rough cut, and I think it's an amazing story. That's the Hussein Nairi kidnapping case.
I mean, the cutting off of the penis. I mean, I don't think that anybody's going to forget that. That poor guy.
Yeah, it is fundamentally horrific. But the cat and mouse game with if anybody wants to read a fascinating story or watch a fascinating story about good cops on the hunt for a really bad guy, I still can't believe everything that we pulled off in that case, and it's worth a look. So Hulu is coming out with that in February. It'll be released 3-parter on Hussein Nairi, and it's called The Wicked Game, I think. And then, of course, it's the last chapter in my book, The Book of Murder.
So you're going to be featured, obviously, in this Hulu one, right?
Yeah,
There's not going to be an actor portraying you.
Yeah, no, they got some shots of me surfing in Manhattan Beach on the smallest, grayest, worst surf day probably in the history of LA. So for those who do watch, I am a better surfer than I appeared on that day. And I would like to say that because I was a DA and they filmed me surfing, I think that makes me a pro surfer. So since technically I got paid, so I'm staking a claim. Kelly Slater is my colleague.
So you're happy with the performance then, even though it was a little gray?
My surfing performance? No, but since I was technically getting money, that makes me a pro.
That makes it okay. All
pro
right.
surfer. Yep.
Okay, well, it was great chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Happy to come back on anytime.
Before I let you go, I want to thank the Los Angeles Times, which was extremely helpful in the research of this episode. And stick with us because up next, we have Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host, Branden Morgan, and I will discuss the case in more detail. And remember, the show is now available on YouTube, so check it out. And as always, thanks for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Branden Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.